"Get out of my garden, or I'll let the dog loose." The rich man shouted, but it was Jesus Christ. The shout cracked the quiet of the gated neighborhood like a gunshot, sharp and practiced, the kind of voice that expected obedience before the echo faded. Grant Whitmore stood planted at the edge of his manicured lawn, millionaire confidence squared in his shoulders, one hand clamped around a taut leash. At the other end, a massive German shepherd strained forward, teeth bared, breath hot, a living warning built to frighten first and ask nothing later. Behind the trimmed hedges, Elena froze with a silver tray trembling against her chest, every instinct telling her to disappear. A few steps away, old Hal the gardener paused mid-snip, shears suspended, knowing he was about to witness something that never happened here. Someone refusing to flinch. The stranger in the garden did not step back. He did not raise his hands. He did not bargain. He stood with an unhurried stillness that felt out of place among sprinkler mist and polished stone. A man in a simple light tunic, with a red mantle resting on his shoulder, as if the morning breeze had decided to stop and listen. Grant yanked the leash harder, savoring the power of fear, waiting for the usual recoil. It didn't come. The dog lunged, then stopped. Muscles that moments ago vibrated with menace went slack, and before anyone could breathe, the animal lowered its head and sat, eyes fixed on the stranger with a recognition that made Elena's stomach drop. The leash fell loose in Grant's fist. He laughed once, brittle and loud, searching for witnesses to share his scorn, but the sound landed wrong, swallowed by a silence that grew heavier by the second. From the hedges, Elena felt something shift, relief threaded with awe, while Hal's hands sank slowly to his sides, prayer forgotten on his lips. The man in the garden took a single step forward, not toward the dog, not toward the house, but into the space fear usually ruled, and his calm spread like shade at noon. Grant opened his mouth to bark another command, to reclaim the scene he owned, yet no insult arrived. The quiet had weight now. It pressed against marble and money and metal gates, and for the first time in years, the man who owned everything felt owned by nothing at all, while the stranger everyone thought didn't belong stood where no one else ever dared, unafraid, unmistakable, as if the ground itself recognized him. The neighborhood was designed to make power feel normal. Iron gates stood taller than people, cameras watched without blinking, and every driveway curved with the quiet confidence of money that never asked permission. Grant Whitmore had chosen this place because it reflected him. Clean lines, perfect symmetry, no surprises. A self-made millionaire, he liked to say, though the phrase usually arrived with a look that warned others not to question the cost. From the balcony windows to the stone path cutting through the lawn, everything existed to remind visitors who was in charge. Those who worked for him understood the rules without needing them written down. Elena learned early to keep her eyes lowered, her footsteps light, her voice smaller than the rooms she cleaned. Gratitude was expected, not offered. Hal the gardener knew which days Grant tolerated conversation and which days silence was safer. He trimmed hedges into obedience, leaving no branch out of line, as if disorder itself were a threat. Even the German shepherd, Bruno, had been trained to perform dominance on command: snarl, pull, intimidate, because fear, when rehearsed, became efficient. Grant liked efficiency. He believed control was the same thing as safety. The house responded to him that way. Doors opened to his fingerprint, alarms hushed at his code, lights brightened when he entered a room. It gave him the reassurance that nothing crossed his boundaries unless he allowed it. That certainty followed him into business deals, dinners, even arguments, especially arguments. When he raised his voice, people moved. When he threatened consequences, people complied. In Grant's world, power worked because everyone agreed to be afraid of losing something. But standing at the edge of the garden now, Grant felt the structure wobble. The dog sat where it had been trained to attack. The stranger remained where fear should have pushed him back. Elena, hidden just moments ago, found herself breathing again, unsure why. Hal sensed it too, an unease that didn't come from danger, but from its absence. The systems Grant trusted: leash, command, reputation, had paused, as if waiting for a new rule to be spoken. Grant straightened his vest, the habitual gesture of a man restoring order. He glanced toward the house, toward the cameras in the gate, as if to remind the moment who owned it. This was his property, his lawn, his authority. The word millionaire had carried him through worse confrontations than this. He had broken men with contracts and smiles sharper than knives. He had buried mistakes under settlements and signatures. Nothing entered his space without being measured, priced, and dismissed. Yet the quiet held, not the awkward quiet of people afraid to speak, but a steadier silence, like the air before a storm that doesn't announce itself. The stranger's presence did not challenge Grant's wealth or mock it. It simply existed unmoved by fences, unpersuaded by threats. And for the first time, the power Grant relied on felt exposed, like a stage light turned the wrong way, revealing not strength, but how carefully it had always been arranged. Grant Whitmore broke the silence with a laugh that carried more contempt than humor. It was the sound he used in boardrooms when someone spoke out of turn, sharp enough to remind everyone where they stood. He flicked his wrist toward the street, not even looking at the man anymore, as if dismissal were a reflex. "You don't belong here," he said, each word pressed flat and clean, the way money taught him to speak. "This neighborhood isn't for people like you." The phrase landed hard because it was familiar. Elena felt it strike her before it ever reached the stranger. She had heard versions of it in quieter forms. Be grateful, don't make trouble, know your place. Hal heard it too, the same tone Grant used when a contractor asked too many questions or a server hesitated at the table. It was a sentence built to sort the world quickly. Owners and intruders, winners and inconveniences. Grant took a step closer, careful to keep the leash loose now, as if the earlier pause with the dog had never happened. "I give to charities," he added, voice thick with self-approval. "I fund shelters. I pay my people well. But I don't give handouts on my lawn." His eyes finally returned to the stranger, scanning the tunic, the dust on the sandals, tallying worth like an accountant. "So take your philosophy and move along." The man did not interrupt. He listened the way people rarely did to Grant, without flinching, without rushing to defend themselves. When he spoke, his voice did not rise to meet the insult. It settled beneath it, steady and clear. "I didn't come to take anything from you," he said. "I came to return what you lost." The words unsettled Grant more than anger would have. He scoffed and glanced toward the hedges, searching for witnesses again, as if ridicule required an audience. "Hear that?" he called out, loud enough for Elena and Hal to hear. "Now he's a philosopher." Elena lowered her gaze out of habit, heat flooding her face, while Hal shifted his weight, the old urge to disappear battling a quiet pull to stay. Grant's mouth curved into a thin smile. "People like you always want something," he went on. "Money, attention, a story. And when you don't get it, you play the victim." He leaned in just enough to invade the space, confident the man would retreat. "This is private property. I don't owe you courtesy." The stranger's eyes met his, not with challenge, not with pity, but with a calm that felt almost misplaced. "You owe more than you think," he said, gently. The simplicity of it stripped the insult of its armor. It was not an argument. It was a statement. Something tightened in Grant's chest, a brief, unwelcome pressure. He straightened, lifting his chin, reclaiming the posture that had always worked. Class was a wall he knew how to build. He had built it brick by brick, deal by deal, and it had kept him safe. But as the man stood there, untouched by the labels meant to shrink him, Grant felt the wall questioned, not attacked, just seen through. Behind the hedges, Elena's breath slowed. For the first time, someone had heard the contempt and refused to carry it. Hal watched Grant's hands clench, then loosen, sensing that the balance had shifted. This was no longer about trespassing. It was about a truth Grant had spent a lifetime paying to avoid, and a stranger who treated that truth as if it belonged here more than fear ever had. Grant Whitmore's patience thinned the way it always did when control slipped through his fingers. He drew a breath to end the exchange, to summon security, to restore the order that usually bent toward him. The stranger's calm felt like a delay tactic, and Grant hated delays. He opened his mouth to deliver a final command, and then the man spoke again, softly, precisely. "Grant." The name cut through the air with an intimacy that did not belong there. Grant froze, not dramatically, not enough for pride to notice at first, but long enough for something cold to settle behind his ribs. He had not given his name. No one had. Elena's fingers tightened around the edge of her tray. Hal's shears dipped, metal whispering against leaves. Even the dog lifted its head, ears pricking, as if sound itself had shifted shape. The stranger did not press the advantage. He did not repeat the name. He simply let it stand, as if it had always been waiting to be heard. Grant forced a laugh, quick and sharp, meant to reclaim the moment. "You've done your homework," he said, glancing toward the house, toward the cameras, toward the places where information lived. Everyone does. But the man shook his head once, gently. I didn't come for your files, he said. I came because you've been afraid for a very long time. The sentence landed without accusation, without drama. It felt less like a verdict and more like a diagnosis. Grant's jaw tightened. Fear was not a word people used about him. Fear was what he managed, what he deployed, what he kept others busy carrying so he wouldn't have to. He straightened, lifting his shoulders, the reflex of a man bracing against a wind he refused to acknowledge. Behind the hedges, Elena felt her pulse slow. Hearing his name spoken that way, without deference, without venom, did something to the space between them all. Hal swallowed hard. He had watched Grant reduce grown men to silence with a look, but this was different. The power in that single word did not come from dominance. It came from recognition. Grant took a step forward, anger gathering heat. You don't get to say my name, he snapped. You don't know me. The man met his eyes, unblinking. Your garden isn't the problem, he said. Your fear is. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Grant's breath caught, shallow and fast, before he forced it steady. The accusation he'd prepared scattered, replaced by a flicker of something dangerously close to memory. For a heartbeat, the house behind him, the alarms, the codes, the walls, felt farther away than it should have. The dog shifted, leash, slack, and sat again with a quiet finality that drew Elena's gaze. She pressed a hand to her chest, unsure why tears threatened. Hal bowed his head without realizing it, an old reflex waking in his bones. Grant searched the man's face for mockery and found none. There was no triumph there, no satisfaction in the disruption, only a steady attention, as if the stranger were listening for a response. Grant had never learned how to give. Who are you? Grant demanded, and for the first time the question carried a crack, thin but real. The man did not answer, not yet. He let the silence hold, heavy and deliberate, until the name Grant Whitmore, millionaire, homeowner, master of his domain, felt smaller than it ever had. Not because it had been taken from him, but because someone had spoken it as if it were a soul, not a title, and expected it to remember what that meant. Grant Whitmore reached instinctively for the small black remote clipped to his vest, the way a man reaches for proof when his authority is questioned. His thumb pressed once. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder, irritation sharpening his breath. The stranger remained still, the garden holding its strange, attentive quiet, as if the space itself were waiting for something Grant had forgotten how to give. Then the gate responded, just not to him. Metal side against metal. Slow, reluctant. The tall iron gate at the front of the property began to move, inch by inch, opening inward with a groan that sounded less like machinery and more like consent. Grant stared, confused first, then furious. He jabbed the button again and again until the plastic creaked beneath his thumb. The system never failed. It answered only his fingerprint, his code. He had paid extra to be sure of that. Elena gasped softly from behind the hedges, one hand flying to her mouth. Hal stepped back, shears lowering, his heart thudding as if the sound of the opening gate had reached somewhere deeper than his ears. Even the dog turned its head toward the entrance, ears alert, not aggressive, as though it recognized an invitation rather than a breach. Grant spun toward the house. Who did this? He barked, the edge of panic breaking through his practiced command. His eyes landed on Elena. Did you touch something? She shook her head, words caught in her throat, fear rising, not of punishment now, but of being seen at the wrong moment. No, sir, she whispered. I didn't. The gate kept opening. It moved with deliberate patience, as if refusing to be rushed, as if no force could hurry it along. The sound echoed through the property, carrying past fountains and stone paths, past windows that had never been opened without permission. Grant felt the ground tilt under his feet. This wasn't how power worked. Machines obeyed, money decided, boundaries held. The stranger took a single step forward, not toward Grant, not toward the house, but toward the open space the gate was creating. His sandals touched the stone with a soft, ordinary sound that somehow felt louder than Grant's shout had been earlier. Nothing in his posture claimed the opening. He did not reach for the gate. He did not look at it at all. It's malfunctioning, Grant snapped, though the word rang hollow. He backed toward the path, keeping his distance now, eyes darting between the gate and the man. This is private property. Yes, the stranger said calmly. And still, It opens. The words did not sound like a challenge. They sounded like a fact. Elena felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the sudden, fragile sense that the rules she lived under were not as absolute as she had believed. Hal closed his eyes for a brief second, a prayer slipping free without language. He had spent decades trimming edges, maintaining lines, keeping things neat for men like Grant. Watching the gate move on its own, he wondered what else might finally refuse to stay closed. Grant's chest tightened. The house behind him, once a fortress, felt exposed. Alarms stayed silent. Cameras blinked uselessly. The systems he trusted, his invisible army, stood down without explanation. He swallowed, throat dry, and looked at the man again, searching for trickery, for wires, for the familiar logic of blame. But there was only stillness there, and patience. The gate reached its widest point and stopped, waiting. Not inviting chaos, not announcing danger, just open. For the first time since the man had stepped onto his lawn, Grant Whitmore felt something shift irrevocably. Control had not been taken from him. It had simply stepped aside. And in that open space, fear had nowhere left to hide. The open gate left a quiet behind it, the kind that makes small sounds suddenly feel important. Elena's breath came shallow as she stood half-hidden by the hedge, the silver tray pressed tight against her ribs like a shield she had learned to carry. For years she had mastered the art of being unnoticed, entering rooms without disturbing air, leaving without leaving questions. In this house, that skill had kept her safe, or so she thought. Jesus Christ turned his head, not toward the gate, not toward Grant, but toward her. The movement was simple, unhurried, yet it landed with the weight of a name spoken aloud. Elena felt it before she understood it, a warmth rising in her chest that made her throat ache. His eyes met hers without passing judgment, without measuring her usefulness, without the familiar slide of dismissal. They stayed, as if she were not an accessory to the moment but part of it. "Your dignity," he said, voice low and clear, "does not depend on his permission." The words did not sound loud. They did not need to. They moved through the space like light through water, reaching places Elena had kept closed for a long time. Her hands trembled, and the tray wobbled, then steadied. A tear slipped free before she could stop it. Not from shame, but from relief that someone had named what she had never been allowed to claim. Grant reacted instantly. "Don't talk to my staff," he snapped, the possessive edge sharp. "They're here to work, not to listen to." He stopped, searching for the insult that usually came so easily. It didn't arrive. Jesus Christ did not raise his voice. He did not turn away from Elena when Grant spoke, and that choice mattered more than the words that followed. "They are not your things," he said simply. "They are people." Hal felt his chest tighten. He had been called "my gardener" for so long that the phrase had started to feel like a name. Hearing it corrected out loud, in front of the owner, made his hands curl into fists at his sides. Not in anger, but in a recognition he hadn't felt in years. Elena lowered the tray to the stone path with careful respect, as if placing something fragile down for the first time. The small sound echoed. Grant's eyes flicked to it, irritated, then uncertain. The act was quiet, but it carried a refusal he could not command away. Elena lifted her chin. "Just a fraction. Enough." For a moment, the hierarchy of the garden rearranged itself. The millionaire stood speechless, his authority stalled mid-command. The employees he expected to vanish were visible now, breathing, standing, present. The open gate waited in the distance, and the dog remained seated, calm, as if guarding a peace no one had trained him to recognize. Jesus Christ shifted his gaze back to Grant, but the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. Elena had been seen, not as labor, not as a liability, as a person. And once dignity enters a space, it does not ask permission to stay. Grant Whitmore recovered first through habit. When words failed him, procedure never did. He turned sharply toward the house, fingers already dialing security in his mind, voice lifting with the authority that had ended countless confrontations before. "That's enough," he said, clipped and controlled. "You're trespassing. I'm calling this in." Jesus Christ did not argue. He did not step aside. He did not challenge the threat. Instead, he looked past Grant, past the glass and steel and curated calm of the mansion, and spoke with the precision of someone aiming for a single point beneath layers of armor. "Your past is inside that house," he said. "In a box you've never opened." The sentence struck Grant harder than any insult. He stiffened, eyes narrowing, the way they did when a negotiation took a turn he hadn't planned. "What box?" he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." Jesus Christ tilted his head slightly, listening, not to Grant's denial, but to the fear behind it. "You hid it because you thought distance could keep it quiet," he continued, "but it learned your address." Elena felt her breath hitch. She had cleaned every room in that house dozens of times, dusted shelves that held nothing personal, wiped fingerprints from frames that revealed nothing true. She remembered the study, the one room Grant never let her enter alone. The painting that never moved, the air that felt heavier there. Hal remembered it too. The gardener had seen Grant once, years ago, standing in the doorway of that room long after dark, unmoving, like a man guarding a grave. At the time, Hal had looked away. He had learned which curiosities cost less when buried. Grant laughed, louder than necessary. "You think you can scare me with riddles?" he said. "I don't keep secrets. I keep assets." Jesus Christ met his gaze. "Then why does your voice change when I mention your mother?" The name fell into the garden like a dropped glass. Grant's face drained of color, replaced by something raw and unguarded that lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Elena pressed her hand to her mouth. Hal bowed his head instinctively, as if a truth had just been named in a place it had waited a long time to be spoken. "You don't get to say that," Grant whispered, the command weaker now, fraying at the edges. "You don't get to bring her into this." "Lo, the box does," Jesus Christ replied gently. "The one behind the painting. The one with the letter you never finished reading." Grant took a step back. Not far. Just enough to put space between himself and the words. His mind raced, scrambling to rebuild Wall's law, money, threat. But the walls had a crack now, and memory leaked through. A small apartment, a cold night, a promise made in fear and sealed with silence. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not—" "You were a child," Jesus Christ said. "And the sentence did not accuse," it explained. "And the box holds what you couldn't afford to feel then." The garden was silent again, but this time it was not waiting, it was listening. Elena felt tears sting, not for herself now, but for the boy she suddenly saw standing inside the man who had terrified her. Hal exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing into a single truth. The strongest men he had known were often guarding the smallest, most wounded places. Grant turned toward the house, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the door as if it might deny him entry. For the first time, he did not look like a man defending property. He looked like someone standing outside a locked room, afraid of what would happen if it finally opened. The front door opened from the inside, not with urgency, but with the hesitant certainty of someone following a sound that would not let her stay seated. Vivian Whitmore stepped onto the stone path barefoot, silk robe drawn tight around her as if the morning air had suddenly turned cold. In one hand, she clutched a yellowed envelope that looked painfully out of place against the polished calm of the house edges, soft, paper worn thin by time and touch. "Grant," she called, her voice carrying a tremor she could not hide. "What's going on?" "And why?" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the man in the garden. The one in the light tunic with the red mantle resting quietly on his shoulder. For a moment, her breath caught. Not from fear, but from recognition she had no language for, like walking into a chapel without realizing it was there. Grant turned sharply, the instinct to command rising fast. "Go back inside," he snapped. "Now. This doesn't concern you." But Vivian did not move. Her fingers tightened around the envelope, dust smudging the silk at her chest. "The box was open," she said. Words careful, deliberate. The painting had shifted. "And this," she lifted the envelope slightly, as if afraid it might fall apart if raised too high. "This was on your desk, waiting." 2. Elena felt the world narrow to that envelope. She had never seen anything personal cross that threshold. Hal's heart thudded in his ears. He had trimmed the hedges outside that study for years, never knowing the truth inside had been breathing, patient. Grant took a step toward Vivian, eyes flashing with panic he could no longer fully disguise. "That doesn't belong to you," he said, too quickly. "Put it down." Vivian's gaze did not drop. For the first time in a long while, she looked at him without searching for permission. "I've lived in this house for 12 years, she said softly. "I share your bed, your name, your life. And yet I don't know who you become when you close that door." She swallowed. voice tightening. I'm tired of living with a room I'm not allowed to enter. Jesus Christ raised a hand not to stop Grant, but to steady the moment. Do not be afraid, he said to Vivian, his tone carrying a peace that settled her shoulders. The truth does not destroy those who receive it with humility. Grant flinched at the sound of his wife's name spoken with such gentleness. You don't get to preach in my home, he barked, pointing at the red mantle as if it were a provocation. I didn't invite you. I didn't come to perform, Jesus Christ replied calmly. I came to heal what shouting has kept wounded. Vivian stepped forward, the envelope pressed to her heart now. I heard the alarm, she said, eyes shining with unshed tears. I saw the camera turn, and still the scariest thing was realizing your study felt awake. She glanced down at the paper. Like it had been holding its breath, Grant's hands curled into fists. Around them, the garden felt smaller, drawn inward by the weight of what had surfaced. Elena sensed it in her chest. A tightening mixed with hope. Hal shifted closer to the path, unwilling to retreat from this turning. Vivian met the stranger's eyes again, courage trembling but present. I didn't go looking for this, she said, but it found me. Jesus Christ inclined his head, a silent affirmation. The envelope rustled softly in the breeze, a fragile sound that carried more truth than any threat Grant had ever made. The letter had opened itself, and with it, a door no command could close again. The sound arrived before the people did, a short electronic chime from inside the house, followed by the muted thrum of engines slowing at the gate. Grant Whitmore seized on it like a lifeline. He straightened, relief flashing across his face as authority rushed back into reach. Good, he said sharply. Security's here. This ends now. Two men in dark uniforms moved briskly up the stone path. Derek Stone in front, broad-shouldered and efficient. Evan Park a step behind, eyes scanning for threat. They took in the scene quickly. The open gate, the dog sitting unnaturally calm. Elena standing where she had never stood before. Vivian clutching an envelope like evidence. And then they saw the man in the tunic and red mantle, still, composed, as if the arrival had changed nothing. Grant pointed, finger rigid. He crossed the gate, he snapped. I want him removed, now. Derek nodded out of habit and reached for his radio. But before a word could be spoken, a sharp buzz cut through the air. The wall-mounted camera near the entry path whirred, rotated slightly, and then went dark. Its small red light blinked once, twice, and shut off. The control panel by the door followed, emitting a soft tone before its screen faded to black. Evan frowned. That's odd, he muttered, tapping his earpiece. Static answered him. Derek checked his device, jaw tightening. Signal's down. Grant stared at the dead camera, then at the panel, pressing buttons that had always obeyed him. That's impossible, he said, louder than necessary. Everything's recorded. Check again. From behind the hedges, Elena felt a shiver of awe and fear ripple through her. Hal crossed himself without thinking, the motion small but sincere. The house, so used to watching, had fallen silent. A patrol vehicle rolled through the open gate and stopped with practiced precision. Captain James Morales stepped out, followed by Officer Lisa Nguyen and Officer Tyler Reed. Their presence brought a different kind of gravity, calm, observant, unhurried. Morales surveyed the scene, eyes lingering on the open gate and the lifeless camera before settling on Grant. Mr. Whitmore, Morales said evenly, we received an intrusion alert and an alarm activation. What's going on? Grant exhaled hard, grateful for a uniform that answered to law rather than faith. This man entered my property without permission, he said, gesturing again. I want him removed. Vivian stepped forward before anyone else could speak. He isn't threatening anyone, she said, voice trembling but firm. What's threatening is what we've been hiding. Morales glanced at the envelope in her hand, then at Jesus Christ, who made no move to defend himself. He stood as if defense were unnecessary. Sir, Morales said to Grant, we're going to slow this down. No one's being removed until we understand the situation. Grant's face flushed. You can review the footage, he insisted. The cameras are offline, Gwen interjected, checking her tablet. All of them. Same with the house panel. Silence pressed in again, thicker now. The systems Grant trusted, the witnesses he paid for, had gone mute. No replay, no proof framed his way. Jesus Christ spoke quietly, not to the officers, but into the moment itself. You can record faces, he said, but truth doesn't need a camera. Morales felt a chill he could not explain. He met Grant's eyes, seeing not a victim of trespass, but a man losing ground. Mr. Whitmore, he said, right now, nobody touches anybody. We're here to prevent an abuse. Grant opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time, the law did not echo his will. The cameras had gone silent, and in their absence, the truth began to speak louder than any recording ever could. Vivian's hands trembled as she looked down at the envelope, its paper thinned by time and secrets. The garden seemed to lean toward her, waiting. Grant took a sharp step forward, panic sharpening his voice. Don't, he said. That letter means nothing. It's old. It's confused. But Vivian had already opened it. The paper unfolded with a dry, fragile sound, like a door no one had dared to touch in years. She read the first line silently, then again aloud, her voice barely steady. It was written in her mother-in-law's hand, careful, rounded, apologetic before it ever reached the apology. Elena felt her knees weaken. Hal bowed his head, as if the words themselves were holy ground. I'm sorry for the money I accepted, Vivian read, and the sentence seemed to strike the air. Grant recoiled as if slapped. I believed it would protect you, the letter continued, but it only taught you to hide. Grant's protest rose too late. She didn't know what she was writing, he said, but the certainty was gone. His eyes darted to the officers, to the silent cameras, to the man in the red mantle who had not moved. Vivian swallowed and kept reading. The letter named it plainly now. A sealed envelope offered by the company, delivered quietly, meant to close a case that should never have been closed. A worker blamed to spare the powerful. Records adjusted. Questions buried. I took the money so you would never go hungry again, the letter said. And in doing so, I fed your fear. Elena pressed a hand to her mouth. She had seen envelopes passed in kitchens before, always accompanied by lowered voices and promises that sounded like threats. Hal felt the weight of it settle in his chest. He had lived long enough to know how often silence was bought, not chosen. Grant's voice cracked. Stop reading, he said. Not here, not in front of everyone. The command sounded smaller than he intended, stripped of the force that once moved rooms. Jesus Christ spoke gently, as if answering the letter rather than the man. Money can buy quiet, he said, but it cannot buy peace. Vivian lifted her eyes from the page. For the first time, she looked at Grant not as a wife bracing for anger, but as a witness to his unraveling. Your mother wrote that the envelope came with instructions, she said softly. To close the file, to blame the least protected, to move on. Captain Morales shifted his stance, attention sharpening. Officer Nguyen glanced at Reed, a silent exchange passing between them. This was no longer a domestic dispute or a trespass complaint. It was a confession unfolding in daylight. Grant shook his head, denial faltering. She was afraid, he insisted. She did what she had to do. Yes, Vivian replied, voice steady now. And fear taught you to do the same. The letter reached its final lines, and Vivian's breath caught. If you ever read this, she read, it means the box opened without my help. Forgive me. And forgive yourself by telling the truth. The garden fell silent again, but it was a different silence, one heavy with consequence. Elena set the tray down carefully, as if noise itself would be disrespectful. Hal took a step closer, unwilling to retreat from what had finally surfaced. Grant stood frozen, the millionaire stripped of his script, staring at a truth he could not pay to erase. The envelope had done what years of intimidation could not. It had named the wound, and once named, it refused to close quietly again. The house seemed to inhale as they moved inside, the polished hallway swallowing sound until footsteps felt too loud. Grant walked ahead as if by instinct, drawn toward the study he had guarded for years without ever naming why. Vivian followed, the letter folded against her palm. Elena and Hal hovered at the threshold, uncertain but unable to turn away, while Captain Morales and the officers entered with the measured calm of people trained to witness what others hide. The painting shifted before anyone touched it. Not dramatically, just enough. A soft scrape of wood against wall, a misalignment that shouldn't have happened. Grant froze. His hand lifted, then stopped mid-air, fingers trembling as if the choice itself had weight. The painting slid a fraction more, and behind it, a narrow panel breathed open. The room went still. Inside the cavity sat a small wooden box and, beneath it, a shallow drawer Grant would have sworn did not exist. The drawer eased outward on its own, revealing an old tape recorder and a faded photograph curled at the edges. Elena gasped. Hal stepped back, heart pounding. Vivian's breath hitched. The photo showed two young men in factory uniforms, arms around each other, smiling with the careless hope of people who still believed truth mattered. Grant recognized his father instantly. Arthur Whitmore, leaner, younger, eyes unburdened. Beside him stood another man, the name printed on a badge just visible. Thomas Medina. No, Grant whispered, the word barely forming. That's not. Captain Morales lifted the recorder with gloved hands and placed it gently on the desk. We'll log everything, he said, professional, steady. But first, we need to hear it. Grant shook his head, backing away as if the object could strike him. If I hear it, he said, voice breaking, I can't pretend anymore. Jesus Christ stood near the doorway, silent, present, not urging and not stopping. His gaze held Grant without pressure. Pretending is what's been hurting you, he said softly. Vivian reached for Grant's wrist, not to restrain him, just to remind him he wasn't alone. Grant swallowed, eyes burning, and nodded once. Morales pressed play. Static hissed. Then the low hum of machinery filled the room, followed by a man's voice, tired, steady, unmistakably Arthur's. Hector, the voice faltered, corrected itself. Grant, if you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it back. Grant's knees weakened. Vivian tightened her grip. Arthur's voice continued. Each word measured like someone choosing courage one sentence at a time. He spoke of an accident that wasn't an accident, of records altered, of pressure applied where truth should have stood. He named the lie, he named the fear, he named the man who ordered silence. And then he said the words Grant had never known he needed. I didn't leave you. They took my voice. Elena felt tears spill freely now. Hal closed his eyes, lips moving in a prayer without sound. Morales and the officers leaned in, the air shifting from suspicion to evidence. The tape ended with a breath and a final plea. Don't build your life on what scared us. Build it on what frees others. Silence followed, dense and unavoidable. Grant stood hollowed out, staring at the photograph as if it had turned into a mirror. The Millionaire's defenses, contracts, cameras, commands, had collapsed into a single truth recorded decades ago and preserved by love that refused to disappear. For the first time, the power in the room belonged not to money or fear, but to proof. And proof, once spoken, does not ask permission to change everything. The silence after the tape ended felt heavier than any accusation. It pressed against the walls of the study, against the photograph on the desk, against Grant Whitmore's chest until breathing became work. For years he had mastered the art of filling silence contracts, threats, laughter sharpened into knives. Now, none of it returned when he reached for it. A phone vibrated on the desk, sudden and insistent. The name on the screen froze him where he stood. Gerald Ledman, the man who had taught him how power really moved. The mentor who always arrived with solutions wrapped in smiles. The call kept ringing, patient, confident. Captain Morales stepped closer, eyes steady. Put it on speaker. Grant's fingers hovered. Vivian's hand found his forearm, not pleading, not pushing present. Elena watched from the doorway, heart pounding, realizing this was the moment men like Grant usually chose themselves. Hal's shoulders sagged with a tired hope he barely trusted. Jesus Christ stood near the window, the red mantle quiet against the light. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence asked a single question that did not shout. Who will you obey now? Grant swallowed and tapped the screen. Gerald's voice filled the room, smooth and assured. He spoke of fixing things, of making problems disappear, of protecting Grant's image. He spoke as if the truth were a loose wire to be taped down. We can settle this, Gerald said. You don't have to ruin everything. Grant closed his eyes. The words everything echoed, and for the first time, he understood how little they meant. He looked at the photograph again, at his father's face, at Thomas Medina's name, at Vivian's eyes, clear and unafraid, at Elena, standing upright, no longer invisible. I'm done hiding, Grant said, voice rough but steady. I'm cooperating. I'm turning over the documents, and I'm naming you. The line went quiet. Then Gerald laughed thin, dangerous. You're making a mistake. No, Grant replied. I've been living one. Captain Morales moved, efficient and calm. Officers documented, recorded, secured the evidence. The room shifted from confrontation to consequence. Power changed hands without a struggle. From the doorway, Elena felt tears fall not from fear this time, but from a strange, fragile relief. Hal let out a breath he had been holding for years. Vivian leaned into Grant's side, not as a shield for his wealth, but as a witness to his choosing. Grant turned toward Jesus Christ, eyes wet, voice breaking. Why didn't you leave when I told you to? Jesus Christ met his gaze with a mercy that did not excuse and did not condemn. Because you were still breathing, he said gently, and while you breathe, there is a way back. Oh, Grant nodded, shame and gratitude colliding in his chest. He bowed his head not in defeat, but in surrender, and for the first time, the man who had owned everything allowed himself to be owned by the truth. As officers escorted Gerald away and the house exhaled, the garden outside felt different, less like a fortress, more like a beginning. The gate remained open. And if this story moved you, if you believe choosing justice over pride can still change a life, subscribe to the channel Stories of Grace for more powerful stories of faith, redemption, and modern-day miracles.